Attention! The case you are about to hear has been hidden for decades. Before we begin, write in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is at this exact moment. The soil moved, almost imperceptibly at first. A slight tremor beneath the frozen ground of the cemetery. According to the night watchman, it was not uncommon to see such disturbances in the newly turned earth. But what happened next would haunt Denver for generations, even as officials tried to erase all evidence of its occurrence. Everything began in Denver, United States of America, during the particularly harsh winter of 1929. The city had grown prosperous in the decades following the gold rush. Grand mansions lined the neighborhoods of Capitol Hill and Cheeseman Park, while downtown businesses thrived despite the economic uncertainties brewing across the nation. But beneath this veneer of progress and civility, something darker was taking root in the abandoned mining tunnels beneath the city. According to records preserved in the Colorado Historical Society archives, the Order of Eternal Resurrection first appeared in Denver newspaper mentions in early January of 1929. A small, classified advertisement in the Rocky Mountain News sought individuals of unwavering faith for a spiritual community dedicated to transcending mortal limitations. The contact listed was one Reverend August Blackwood, formerly of Boston, Massachusetts. Blackwood had arrived in Denver the previous autumn, tall and lean, with penetrating gray eyes that witnesses described as simultaneously gentle and unsettling. His credentials appeared impeccable. Seminary training in Europe, previous congregation leadership in New England, references from respected clergymen. Yet research conducted decades later would reveal disturbing gaps in his history, periods of time unaccounted for, and at least 3 instances where he had been quietly asked to leave positions of religious authority. What drew people to Blackwood was his voice. A recording discovered in 1952 captured a fragment of one sermon. The quality is poor, the words largely indecipherable, but even through the static and distortion, there is something in the cadence and tone that creates an immediate sense of trust. Experts in psychological manipulation who later analyzed this recording described it as employing subtle hypnotic techniques, particularly the use of patterned breathing and strategic pauses. By March, Blackwood had gathered a congregation of approximately 30 dedicated followers. They met initially in rented rooms above a pharmacy on 16th Street, but soon relocated to a property Blackwood purchased on the outskirts of the city. A former sanatorium that had closed its doors in 1918 after a scandal involving patient treatment. The sprawling Victorian structure sat on 4 acres of land, much of it wooded and secluded from neighboring properties by a high stone wall. The order operated publicly as a non-denominational spiritual retreat. Local newspapers occasionally covered their charity work, feeding the homeless and visiting the elderly. Nothing in these early accounts suggested anything beyond conventional religious practice, albeit with an emphasis on spiritual rebirth and transcendence. But internally, according to journals recovered years later, the practices were evolving in increasingly extreme directions. New members underwent what was called the initiation of dust, during which they were required to spend 3 days in a darkened room with only water, contemplating their own mortality. Upon emerging, they were ceremonially washed and given new names, signifying their rebirth into the order. Elizabeth Chambers, a 27-year-old widow, wrote in her journal that the experience left her feeling cleansed of grief. In neat, careful penmanship, she described how the darkness had become a presence, almost a companion, by the 3rd day. She believed she had heard her deceased husband speaking to her, assuring her that death was merely a threshold, not an ending. This journal entry is dated April 12, 1929. It is the last entry in her hand. Meetings of the inner circle, which numbered 12, including Blackwood, took place in the sanatorium basement. The room had once housed the facility boiler and was accessible only through a narrow staircase behind a door that remained locked at all times. Blackwood carried the only key on a chain around his neck. According to testimony provided later by Samuel Wilson, who served as Blackwood caretaker and chauffeur, these meetings often lasted until dawn, and those who emerged appeared exhausted, yet exhilarated, their eyes feverishly bright. Wilson, who never joined the order but observed its operations closely, noted that Blackwood began to speak increasingly of the temporary nature of death, that the body was merely a vessel that could be abandoned and reclaimed, that consciousness persisted even as flesh failed, that faith strong enough could reverse the finality of the grave. The first disappearance occurred in late April. Margaret Sullivan, a 32-year-old schoolteacher who had joined the order in February, failed to report for her classes at Grant Elementary School. When authorities visited her boarding house, they found her room meticulously organized, as if she had simply stepped out for the day. The only unusual element was a leather-bound book on her nightstand, containing passages copied from obscure theological texts, many concerning resurrection and the liminal space between life and death. When questioned, Reverend Blackwood expressed concern, but suggested that Sullivan had mentioned plans to visit family in Colorado Springs. No record of her arrival there was ever established. The matter received little attention at the time, as adult disappearances were not uncommon, and Sullivan had no immediate family in Denver to press for investigation. Throughout May, the order grew increasingly isolated from the broader community. The charity work ceased, the gates to the property remained closed, deliveries were accepted at the gate, but no visitors were permitted entry. Former members who had drifted away spoke of increasing demands for commitment and uncomfortable new rituals, though they were vague about specifics, as if fearful of breaking some oath of silence. A delivery boy for a local grocer reported that on his last visit to the property, he heard what sounded like chanting coming from behind the main building. He described the voices as monotonous and somehow mechanical in their precision. When he mentioned this to the woman who accepted the delivery, her expression changed instantly from pleasant to rigid, and he was told his services would no longer be required. On the morning of June 3rd, a groundskeeper at Riverside Cemetery discovered a disturbed grave. The soil above a recent burial had been extensively excavated and then roughly replaced. When cemetery officials investigated, they found the coffin empty. The deceased, a young man named Thomas Reed, who had died of tuberculosis 2 weeks earlier, was missing. What made this particularly notable was that Reed had been a member of the Order of Eternal Resurrection. Police reports from the time indicate that the cemetery caretaker initially suspected common grave robbery, then practiced by some medical schools to obtain cadavers for study. But certain details troubled investigators. The excavation appeared to have been conducted with ritual precision rather than hasty efficiency. Small objects were found pressed into the disturbed soil: coins, feathers, scraps of paper with indecipherable writing, and strangest of all, a silver pendant in the shape of a key, identical to one Reverend Blackwood was known to wear. When police visited the order property that afternoon, they were refused entry without a warrant. Through the gate, they observed an unusual level of activity, with members hurriedly moving between buildings. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys despite the warm June weather, and from somewhere deep within the property came the rhythmic sound of digging. The warrant was obtained the following morning. By then, the property appeared deserted. No one answered repeated knocks at the main building. Windows stood open, curtains billowing in the breeze. Personal belongings remained in living quarters, suggesting the departure had been sudden and perhaps unplanned. In the basement room where the inner circle met, police found an elaborate arrangement of candles, strange symbols painted on the floor and walls, and 12 chairs arranged in a circle. In the center lay a mound of freshly turned earth. When disturbed, investigators discovered a small compartment beneath the soil. approximately the size of a coffin, but empty. Behind the main building, near the edge of the wooded area, they found what appeared to be a freshly dug grave. Then another and another. 12 in total, arranged in a perfect circle approximately 30 feet in diameter. Each grave measured 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. Standard burial dimensions, all were empty. A search of Blackwood office revealed journals containing elaborate theological arguments justifying what he called the ultimate demonstration of faith. In his increasingly erratic handwriting, he outlined a belief that true resurrection required literal death, followed by burial, followed by the power of collective faith to restore life. The final entries suggest he had convinced his inner circle to undergo this process voluntarily, with each member taking turns in the ritual death while others maintained a continuous prayer vigil. What troubled investigators most was the absence of any bodies, living or dead. No trace of Blackwood or any of the inner circle members was found on the property. No evidence of mass transportation away from the site was discovered. It was as if 12 people had simply vanished, leaving behind only the empty graves prepared for their demonstration of faith. The case generated sensational headlines for several weeks. The Denver Post ran a front-page story titled "The Vanishing Congregation." Speculation ranged from mass suicide in another location to elaborate fraud, with Blackwood absconding with funds collected from followers. Some even suggested the entire inner circle had been buried somewhere on the expansive property, prompting authorities to bring in dogs trained to detect human remains. Nothing was found. Then, on June 28th, exactly 25 days after the discovery of the empty graves, a night watchman at Riverside Cemetery reported hearing sounds coming from the Reed family plot, the same site where Thomas Reed Coffin had been found empty weeks earlier. The watchman, Harold Jenkins, initially dismissed the noise as an animal, but as he approached, the sound resolved into what he described in his statement as a rhythmic scratching, like fingernails against wood coming from beneath the ground. Jenkins, rather than investigating further alone, ran to the nearest telephone and called the police. By the time they arrived 20 minutes later, the sound had stopped, but the earth above the grave showed signs of movement. Soil displaced from below rather than disturbed from above. The officers present made the decision to exhume the site. 6 feet down, they found Thomas Reed Coffin, returned to its original position. Inside was Reed himself, his body showing advanced decomposition, consistent with his death nearly 6 weeks earlier. But certain details defied explanation. His fingers were raw and bloodied, with splinters embedded under the nails, consistent with someone attempting to claw their way out of a coffin. The coffin interior showed corresponding scratch marks on the underside of the lid, and most inexplicably, according to the medical examiner report, the tissue damage to the fingers appeared to have occurred post-mortem. That same night, residents near Cheeseman Park reported a figure walking slowly through the fog that had settled over the city. The descriptions matched Elizabeth Chambers, the widow who had written so hopefully in her journal about the initiation of dust. According to multiple witnesses, she moved with a strange, shuffling gait, her clothes caked with dirt, her expression blank. She responded to no greetings or questions. By morning, she had vanished again, and despite an extensive search, no trace of her was found. Over the next week, similar reports emerged from across the city. Margaret Sullivan, the schoolteacher who had first disappeared, seen standing motionless outside her former boarding house at 3 in the morning, gone when the landlady went to open the door. Samuel Wilson, the caretaker who had never officially joined the order, found sitting on a bench in the park, unresponsive, his shoes and trouser cuffs thick with the same distinctive red clay that characterized the soil around the order property. None of these individuals were successfully located or detained. Each appeared briefly, witnessed by multiple observers, and then vanished before authorities could intervene. Each sighting occurred between the hours of midnight and dawn. Each individual was described as moving awkwardly, as if relearning how to control their limbs, and each bore signs of having been in contact with grave dirt. On July 7th, a maintenance worker at the Denver Public Library discovered a manuscript that had been placed overnight on a reading table in the reference section. It was written in what experts later confirmed was Reverend Blackwood handwriting, though showing signs of severe deterioration in penmanship compared to his earlier journals. The document, which now exists only in police transcript as the original, was mysteriously lost from evidence storage in 1931, detailed what Blackwood claimed was the successful implementation of the ultimate demonstration of faith. According to the manuscript, all 12 members of the inner circle, including Blackwood himself, had voluntarily undergone burial alive on the night of June 2nd. Each was placed in one of the graves in the circle behind the main building, equipped only with a small breathing tube that extended to the surface, providing limited air. The remaining members of the order were instructed to maintain a constant vigil of prayer and chanting for exactly 24 hours, after which they were to exhume their buried brethren. But something went wrong. The manuscript becomes confused here, with sentences fragmenting and thoughts remaining incomplete. Blackwood alludes to the prayers being insufficient or incorrectly performed, to the air tubes becoming blocked with soil, to the desperate realization, as he lay in his own grave, that the demonstration had failed and death was indeed claiming them all. The next coherent section describes what Blackwood called the threshold space, a state between life and death where consciousness persisted even as bodily functions ceased. He wrote of how the 12 remained aware, unable to move, unable to call out, as their bodies succumbed to asphyxiation and then began the process of decomposition. He described this experience in terms that alternated between religious ecstasy and profound horror. Most disturbing was his claim that after 24 days in this state, something changed, that the collective will of the 12, focused through what he called the geometry of faith created by their circular arrangement, had achieved what their followers' prayers could not, that they had begun to return, not to life as it had been before, but to some approximation of it, that they could move again, could rise from their graves, could walk and observe, though not fully interact with the world they had left behind. The final paragraphs of the manuscript contained what appeared to be instructions for others who might wish to replicate the experience, though with modifications to avoid what Blackwood called the errors in our implementation. These sections were heavily redacted in the police transcript, with a note indicating they were too dangerous to preserve even as evidence. The document ended with a promise, or perhaps a warning, that the 12 were not gone, but transformed, that they would continue to observe from the margins of perception, that they would return in fullness when the correct conditions were achieved. The final line, underlined 3 times, read simply, "We are the first fruits of a greater harvest." Official investigation into the Order of Eternal Resurrection case concluded in August of 1929 with no definitive resolution. The disappearances were documented but unexplained. The manuscript was dismissed as the product of a disturbed mind, possibly written before the disappearances as part of an elaborate hoax. The property where the order had been based was sold at auction in October of that year, the proceeds going to the city after no relatives of the missing members came forward to make claims. For decades, the case gathered dust in police archives, occasionally referenced by journalists or researchers interested in religious extremism or mass disappearances, but largely forgotten by the general public. The property itself passed through multiple owners, none remaining long, each reporting uncomfortable sensations in the buildings and persistent problems with the soil in the rear garden, which refused to support plant life despite repeated efforts at remediation. In 1956, during excavation for a swimming pool installation at the property, workers discovered a circular arrangement of rectangular depressions in the subsoil, each approximately the size and shape of a grave. Despite the area having been extensively landscaped over the intervening years, the imprints of the original graves remained clearly defined in the earth, as if permanently impressed there. Work was abandoned and the property sold again. Reports persisted, though never officially acknowledged, of sightings around Denver, figures moving with unnatural stillness through Cheeseman Park on foggy nights, a woman in outdated dress standing motionless before the former site of the Order property, now demolished and replaced with modern apartments. A tall, gaunt man, resembling Reverend Blackwood, observed multiple times over decades without apparent aging, watching from a distance whenever a burial took place at Riverside Cemetery. In 1977, nearly 50 years after the original events, a doctoral student in religious studies at the University of Colorado discovered a collection of papers in a sealed box in the university archives, donated anonymously in the 1960s. Among them was what appeared to be a continuation of Blackwood manuscript, dated December 25, 1939, a full decade after the disappearances. The handwriting matched authenticated samples of Blackwood, but showed even greater deterioration, as if written by hands that struggled to maintain fine motor control. The content described what the writer called the long diminishment, a gradual loss of the limited physical presence the 12 had achieved. He wrote of how they continued to exist primarily as consciousness without substantial form, able to manifest visibly only under specific conditions and with tremendous effort. Most significantly, the document contained a ritual framework for what Blackwood called the renewal, a process whereby those in the threshold space could regain fuller manifestation through the willing sacrifice of living participants who understood the risks involved. The ritual required 12 new volunteers who would need to recreate the original circumstances, but with critical adjustments to the timing and invocations used. The doctoral student, upon realizing the potential implications of the document, reported her discovery to her faculty advisor. The papers were subsequently removed from the archive by persons unknown before they could be properly documented or authenticated. The student thesis was redirected to another topic, and she later reported being strongly discouraged from discussing the matter further. In April of 1979, exactly 50 years after the first recorded disappearance associated with the Order, Denver police received multiple reports of unusual activity at Riverside Cemetery. Night staff reported seeing a group of individuals in dark clothing moving among the graves after hours. When security personnel attempted to intervene, they found themselves unable to approach closer than approximately 30 feet to the group, describing a sensation like walking against a powerful wind or invisible barrier. By the time police arrived, the group had departed, but investigators found evidence of ritual activity. 12 graves, widely separated throughout the cemetery, but all dating from the original era of the Order, had been circled with a mixture of salt, iron filings, and what laboratory analysis later identified as human bone dust. At the center of each circle was a small hole, approximately 1 inch in diameter, driven directly down to the coffin below, reminiscent of the breathing tubes described in Blackwood manuscript. Over the next month, cemetery workers and visitors reported sounds from these graves, faint but distinct tapping, as if someone below was sending signals, motion in the soil above. In 2 instances, the decorative flags placed by visitors were observed to move without wind, as if manipulated from below. Against standard procedure but responding to growing public concern, authorities exhumed one of the affected graves on May 20, 1979. The coffin, containing the remains of a woman who had died in 1928, was found undisturbed except for a small hole in the lid corresponding to the opening driven down from the surface. The remains showed no unusual features beyond normal decomposition. But pressed into the satin lining of the coffin lid, directly above where the face would have been, was a perfect handprint that laboratory analysis confirmed contained traces of soil from the Order property, despite that location being miles from the cemetery and the grave predating the Order activities. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1979, Denver experienced an unusual pattern of missing persons cases. 12 individuals, ranging in age from 22 to 65, disappeared under circumstances that investigators found troublingly similar to the Order case 50 years earlier. Each had expressed recent interest in spiritual matters related to death and resurrection. Each disappeared, leaving behind their personal effects in seemingly temporary arrangements. Each had been seen in the vicinity of Riverside Cemetery in the days before their disappearance. No connection between these individuals was ever established beyond their similar disappearances. No evidence of foul play was discovered. No bodies were recovered. The cases remain open but inactive in Denver police files, cross-referenced with the original Order of Eternal Resurrection investigation, but officially classified as unrelated. The former Order property was finally demolished in 1984, after standing vacant for several years. During the demolition process, workers discovered a sealed room in the sub-basement, its entrance concealed behind a false wall and unmentioned in any building plans. Inside was a circular chamber, its walls inscribed with symbols matching those described in the original police reports from 1929. In the center of the room was a depression in the earthen floor, shaped like a grave, but only a few inches deep. Soil analysis revealed that this shallow depression contained earth from 12 distinct locations around Denver, including Riverside Cemetery and several private burial grounds. Beneath this layer was a lead box containing a single document, a list of 12 names with dates written beside each. The names corresponded to the 1979 disappearances. The dates ranged from 2029 to 2079, exactly 100 years after each corresponding disappearance in the original case. Public records indicate that the site was quickly paved over and converted to a parking facility. No official explanation for these discoveries was ever released, though internal memoranda from the Denver Historical Society, obtained through Freedom of Information requests decades later, reference an agreement with city officials to minimize publicity around what was termed the regrettable Blackwood incident, to avoid renewed public anxiety. Occasional reports still surface. A night security guard at the Denver Public Library in 1994 described encountering a group of 12 individuals in the reference section after hours, all dressed in clothing from the 1920s, all with the peculiar stillness and awkward movements described in the original witness accounts. When he approached, they reportedly turned to look at him in unison, revealing faces that appeared partially decomposed. When he returned with backup minutes later, the section was empty, but 12 books on resurrection beliefs across various cultures had been removed from shelves and arranged in a circle on the floor. In 2004, a caretaker at Riverside Cemetery reported finding fresh flowers placed on the graves of each known Order member buried there on the 75th anniversary of their disappearance. Security camera footage showed no visitors to those graves during the period when the flowers would have been placed. Each arrangement included white lilies, symbolic of resurrection in many traditions, and a small card bearing the phrase, 75 down, 25 to go. Historians and researchers who have attempted to fully document the case report consistent difficulties. Records disappear from archives. Witnesses become reluctant to speak after initial interviews. Equipment malfunctions during site investigations. These complications have led most serious scholars to abandon study of the Order, dismissing it as an elaborate hoax perpetuated across generations or a case so contaminated by rumor and superstition as to be academically worthless. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from Denver residents living near Riverside Cemetery or the former Order property who claim to occasionally see, particularly on foggy nights or during the anniversary weeks of the original disappearances, figures standing in perfect circles, motionless for hours. Always 12, always arranged with geometric precision. Always gone by morning, leaving only circular depressions in the grass or soil where they stood, as if weighted by something far heavier than human bodies. The most recent documented sighting occurred in 2024. A night shift nurse at Porter Adventist Hospital, located near the former Order property, reported seeing 12 figures standing in the hospital parking lot at approximately 3:15 in the morning. They were arranged in a circle, facing inward, their forms indistinct in the fog but recognizably human. The nurse observed them from a window for several minutes before they slowly raised their arms in unison and then, according to her statement, sank straight down into the ground, leaving no trace of their presence. Hospital security footage from that night shows only static interference during the time period in question. The parking lot surface, inspected the following day, showed no signs of disturbance, but soil samples taken from the site by an independent researcher who had been studying the Order case revealed traces of the distinctive clay from the original property, a geological formation that should not have been present at that location. Some say it was mass hysteria. A charismatic leader who led his followers to unknown fates, possibly murder or suicide, generating urban legends that persist through suggestion and coincidence. That the 1979 disappearances were unconnected, merely given pattern by those looking for continuation of the original mystery. That the various sightings and manifestations are nothing more than the power of suggestion, acting on minds primed by sensational stories. Others point to the physical evidence that continues to accumulate. The handprints in sealed coffins, the soil appearing where it should not be, the persistence of the grave imprints despite repeated landscaping. The documents in Blackwood's unmistakable hand appearing decades after his disappearance, the ritualistic precision of the cemetery, disturbances that match in exact detail the practices described in manuscripts that were never publicly released. What is certain is that on June 2, 1929, 12 people vanished from a property in Denver after preparing graves for what they called the ultimate demonstration of faith. That none were ever conclusively seen alive again in any conventional sense, that reports of their manifestations followed patterns too consistent to easily dismiss, and that exactly 50 years later, 12 more people disappeared after engaging in activities linked to the original Order. June 2, 2029 will mark 100 years since the original demonstration. According to the dates found in the lead box, it represents the first date of anticipated return in fullness for those who entered the threshold space. Whether this represents genuine prophetic information, the delusions of a disturbed mind, or an elaborate multi-generational hoax, remains to be determined. The Order of Eternal Resurrection property now lies beneath a modern commercial complex. Riverside Cemetery continues to operate, though the sections containing graves associated with the Order are often found disturbed despite increased security measures. The records of the original investigation remain available, but incomplete, with key photographs, physical evidence, and witness statements missing from files. The doctoral student who discovered the second manuscript died in 1991. Leaving behind sealed papers with instructions they not be opened until 2029. The circle, it seems, remains unbroken, the demonstration incomplete, the faith still seeking its ultimate proof. Some say none of this ever happened, others prefer not to comment.